It began like a soft click in a world full of noise. Shortwave nets that never sleep lost their breath. A pilot frequency that usually hums like a heartbeat thinned, then fell. Operators looked up from green glow displays and said nothing, because the silence was already speaking. Above it all, far beyond the quiet roofs and the antenna forests, an interstellar body drifted toward the sun's glare, its name a string of calm syllables that felt older than our radios. 3IATLAS moved into conjunction, and the first coincidence planted its flag. Across amateur logs and station boards, the pattern formed in minutes. Southeast Asia reported fading first, then Central Europe, then the Americas. Airwave gardeners who tend narrow bands by habit wrote of dead air where beacons should be. Probably solar, one post said. Official bulletins soon offered the standard cover story. A strong solar flare, indexed in familiar letters, had rolled through the ionosphere and taken our signals with it. Space weather does this. It always has. Except, not always like this. A thread appeared under the noise, quiet but insistent. Several coastal monitors noted that maritime emergency channels dipped out in a narrow window that did not line up with the radiation curve they expected. An Antarctic ham, the kind who chases auroral whispers at 3 a.m, logged a hard drop in the band while his magnetometer barely twitched. A university array, posting to its public dashboard, called the blackout window unusually coherent for a storm day. A whisper list that shares anomalies in plain text asked the question everyone else would not. What if the flare was the alibi, not the cause? You know this channel. We do not shout. We breathe through the tangle. We gather what the night leaves and sort it on a soft table. The subject tonight is not fear. It is attention. If there was a solar storm, we will treat it as anchor and map. If there was something more, we will follow its edges gently. Calm will be our instrument, because calm hears details that agitation misses. If you want to drift with us, settle in. Subscribe so you can return to this quiet strand when you need it. Leave a note about where your radios faded or where they did not. Tell us if your sleep was restless or if the silence passed like a cloud. Share this with the one friend who listens the way you do. This is a documentary for sleep, built for those who think with the lights low and the volume lower. We will keep you safe. We will keep it slow. Now, dim the lights. The file opens on October 21, when the sun looked ordinary through smoke glass, but tasted different on the bands. Shortwave operators who have seen 1,000 storms called this one clean. The fade-outs arrived in crisp intervals, like doors closing one room at a time. An emergency net out of the Pacific reported a dropout of about 10 minutes. A hospital relay in a Midwestern city lost their check-in sequence for almost the same span, precisely offset by a handful of minutes. Two signals that never meet in the air behaved like mirrors. Coincidence is a patient word. Tonight, we test its patience. In the same hours, 3IATLAS slipped behind the sun for most lines of sight. That name still feels strange in the mouth. The third interstellar visitor on our books, cataloged by a survey that finds comets and, sometimes, more than comets. Its path runs close to the plane that holds our planets. It is a quiet orbit for a loud arrival, flat and polite, as if chosen to pass through the busy lanes without drawing thermals of attention. A handful of spectra posted by observatories weeks earlier hinted at metals that do not shout in most comet tales. Nickel appears in many places in the solar system, so the word alone means little. In a calm mind, however, note clusters matter. Composition that tilts heavy, geometry that traces the ecliptic, and a rendezvous with the sun at the very moment our radios stumble. 3 points do not make a verdict. They sketch a shape that asks to be traced. The hard science sits like a spine through this. Solar flares ionize the upper atmosphere. High-frequency signals bend, break, or vanish. Satellites ride those changes and sometimes fail in sympathy. Models exist, tested over decades, that predict the contours of such quiet. The official graphs published that day match a strong event, and there is wisdom in choosing the simple story first. Yet the timing whispers. A few arrays reported that the blackout window closed while the solar radiation storm index stayed moderate. A polar path that usually collapses during these events remained marginally open while equatorial paths blinked out. Patterns like that are not impossible, but they are rare. Here's a grounded speculation, offered with both hands. If an object carried a field device that interacts with charged particles, it might create local pockets that modulate the ionosphere in ways that do not cleanly match solar indices. Imagine a bubble that smooths, sharpens, or briefly retunes the way the sky reflects our signals. Not a weapon in this telling, simply a byproduct of a machine staying warm or efficient. Place that bubble near conjunction, where our sightlines are worst, and the trace on the ground would look like what we felt. A hush that arrives and leaves with the rhythm of design rather than weather. Let an imaginative leap touch down, then lift. Suppose a traveler wanted to measure how a planet listens. It would not transmit a greeting in our language. It would press gently on the fabric that carries our speech and watch what breaks, what reroutes, what resists. Shortwave networks, ham clusters, maritime nets, rescue beacons, aviation checks, a quiet pressure, then release. No flare of intent, only a controlled absence. All of this could be nothing more than a dream exhaled in the ionospheric night. Dreams are data when you are careful. Back on the ground, the night carried its own images. A ship's radio officer drew a line through blank log pages and wrote "silence" in block letters. In a prairie town, an antenna farm stood like a forest in wind that did not move, each metal stalk listening for a sky that would not answer. In an apartment 2 floors up, a listener who never sleeps through a storm smiled at the low hiss that remained. Even silence has texture if you are kind to it. He turned the dial slowly and heard only the room. The refrigerator clicked. The heater whispered. The band stayed flat. We keep an eye on the places where facts meet absence. High-resolution frames of Atlas taken near the Mars leg of its path were mentioned briefly in a project update, then not shown. The timing might be administrative. It might be nothing. The interplanetary relays that passed telemetry through deep space networks did not report a major outage. Instead, several small dips appeared in the logs of older systems that should have been asleep or obsolete. The reports are scattered, secondhand, and easy to dismiss. They are also strangely aligned with the blackout window. In a storm, most oddities smear. These look like dots laid down with a fine pen. We return to sleep science. Calm helps the brain link distant pieces without forcing them. During strong solar days, magnetometers at mid-latitudes draw smooth hills. On our day, some citizen instruments posted gentle plateaus, then clean steps. The auroral oval was wide but not wild. If you held that curve in your hand, you would notice how level it feels, and how the steps happen in pairs. Several operators mentioned a double hush. They lost the band, it returned. Then 10 minutes later, the room emptied again. That cadence is not proof. It is a clock that ticks with an intention we do not yet understand. Our aim in this series is not to accuse. We ask whether coincidence remains the best word once the angles and intervals settle into view. Atlas had the geometry to hide inside natural brightness. The sun provided a physical reason for global disturbance. Our instruments, both official and improvised, saw effects that mostly fit the weather and partly did not. When a mystery wants to be found, it dresses in a pattern. When a power wants to be unseen, it dresses in the same. We will end this chapter where the air thins. Night stations came back to life in waves. A coastal beacon returned like a lighthouse after fog. The hospital relay caught its final check-in and closed the net. The apartment listener fell asleep to a weak station from far south that rode the gray line like a patient swimmer. Somewhere behind the sun, a traveler crossed a seam we could not join. We will meet it again when it steps out of the glare. For now, hold the question quietly. If the silence was only weather, why did it keep such steady time? If it was a message, who chose a language made of absence? The bulletin arrived with the tidy certainty of weather. A square of text, time-stamped, coded, almost comforting in its order. X-class flare, magnitude about 1.6, active region numbered for our peace of mind, effects described in phrases we have learned to trust, D-layer absorption, shortwave fade on the sunlit side, expect degraded HF communications. It reads like a train schedule. You can set your pulse to it and feel rational again. We begin with what is solid. Strong flares pump X-rays into the upper atmosphere. The lowest ionospheric layer grows dense, then greedy, and it eats the high frequencies we send its way. On the day side, there is quiet where there should be chatter. This is called a Dellinger event, and it is as old as our habit of listening to the sky. For the right class of flare, the blackout spans continents. It falls off toward the terminator, softens near the edges, and it usually arrives like a heavy curtain rather than a series of neatly cut panels. That is the map you carry into a storm. Set that map beside the day we met. Operators in regions that shared daylight reported a hush that looked unusually crisp. Not a smear, not a wash, but two clean intervals that matched each other the way twins do. Similar, yet offset. Several public solar monitors track the X-ray flux, peaking near the top of the hour, then relaxing to a steady background. Yet the second quiet window for many bands opened after the flux had already calmed. If you live with storms, you know the feeling when your instrument says one thing and your ear says another. The ear keeps its own archives. It seldom lies. We read the official curves carefully. The radiation numbers justified an R3 level event. Strong, but not absurd. The proton flux rose, but not like a cliff. The auroral oval widened, but did not roar. A subset of equatorial routes went dark, while a few polar cap paths, the ones that usually collapse first, remained barely passable. Marine operators off the west coast described a 10-minute hole that reappeared as a 5-minute echo. Transpolar pilots, who live and die by advisory codes, saw less chaos than their manuals led them to expect. None of this breaks physics. Together, it strains the feeling of an ordinary day. Hard fact to anchor us again. The active region that threw the flare sat near a position that should have spread the impact smoothly across a familiar footprint. You could lay a transparent sheet from a similar recent event over the globe and expect strong overlap. This time, the edges looked cut by a patient hand. Southern mid-latitudes went out in narrow bands, then reported return to service as nearby zones still held their breath. Several university magnetometers, the kind installed for teaching and left to run as public service, drew steps where hills should sit, plateaus, then sharp drops, then plateaus. Storm science knows steps. Yet, when they appear in pairs that repeat in different longitudes within the same hour, they invite attention. A grounded speculation offered without heat. If a secondary driver added structure to the absorption, the blackout could look sliced. Picture a moving lens in the plasma, a region that reorders charges so that RF is damped or enhanced along select paths. Such a lens could come from a sheath around a body that carries its own field, or from a wake that the solar wind shapes around it. The sun remains the power. The lens chooses the geometry. Radio waves do not care about motives. They follow gradients like rain follows a roofline. The geometry of the day carried its own sly teachings. 3IATLAS occupied a position that aligned with the ecliptic and slid into solar glare for most terrestrial observers. That is a natural place for an interstellar body to be at that stage. It is also an exceptional place to hide anything that modifies the medium around it. When a body with a magnetic personality passes through a conductive fog, it writes patterns that can be read at a distance by any species that throws signals and watches their returns. We did that all day, without being asked, and someone could have been taking notes. Look again at the twin quiets. A coastal rescue net reported a clean outage at the top of the hour, regained function, then fell out again with a small offset. A medical network inland described the same cadence. In both trials, a handful of narrow channels in the lower HF range stayed barely alive while higher bands died, which is backwards for simple D-layer absorption at that power. A small cluster of very low-frequency monitors, the kind that samples submarine ranges, showed wiggles that marched to the same drumbeat as the HF gaps. Crossband echoes like that usually require structured ionization, not a single uniform splash. We have an image to hold. In a picture we will never see, the sun is a white plate that fills the field. A dark coin slides across its rim, far too tiny to notice in the blaze. Around that coin, a faint halo gathers particles like lint clinging to glass. The halo breathes with the wind. It turns. It pulls threads. Where the threads run, the ionosphere below sets like cooling sugar. For a few minutes, our words no longer skip cleanly. They melt into the air and do not return. Then the wind shifts and the kitchen opens again. You and I will never capture that image, yet the pattern on the ground suggests its shape. One more grounded speculation. Not a weapon, not a strike, only a systems test. If the traveler's technology manages its waste heat or its radiation pressure with active fields, those fields could briefly sharpen the day's solar effect into organized quiet. The second hush could be a control run at a different setting. The choice of moments would seem elegant if it were intentional. Use the flare to write the cover story, then ride under that story while you listen to a planet itch under your palm. Our models on Earth would show a plausible storm. Our logs would show something more exact. It is reasonable to ask for direct proof. We do not have it. We have seams. Seams are where cloth was cut and joined. In open data repositories, a few instruments at equatorial stations marked on and off ticks with the kind of precision that suggests a clock no one declared. Several aging satellites, the kind that sit in orbits too useful to bury and not useful enough to love, showed brief telemetry errors in overlapping windows. You could wave at cosmic rays and be done, but these were old machines that had slept well through worse days. Ghosts can be explained. Patterns imposed on ghosts look like handwriting. An imaginative leap, small and slow. Imagine a language that refuses to risk being misunderstood by ears as crude as ours. It does not say hello with a burst of meaning. It says hello with a subtraction. It takes away the medium that carries our noise, just for a few minutes, then gives it back. It waits, then takes it again. It looks for our tests, our response times, our ability to reroute, our contingency habits. A radio blackout becomes a controlled experiment. The results go into a quiet book we will never read. Perhaps that book was already open on a desk behind the sun. We keep the poet awake while the physicist measures. Numbers like total electron content and maximum usable frequency belong to the daylight side of this story. They fell in the right direction. They fell by enough to justify the bulletin, and yet they fell in steps that kept rhyming. A rhyme is not evidence. It is a finger that points. When a day looks ordinary yet tastes crafted, you can either call your tongue untrustworthy or admit that some hands work with very fine tools. Our conclusion for this file is smaller than a verdict. The solar flare alibi is good science. It stands. It is the right first explanation. It also leaves thread ends on the table. Twin quiet windows across separated networks. Polar routes holding while lower latitudes fall in narrow strips. Low frequency monitors nodding on the same beat as higher bands. Dormant satellites blinking with timing that looks almost rehearsed. You can accept every piece and still feel that the pattern was edited by something besides weather. Listen to the tone we keep. Calm, patient, unafraid to say we do not know. The traveler could be innocent of any intent. A field that keeps a machine stable can sing in other people's kitchens. We notice the song, we mark the time. We prepare to listen again when Atlas steps back out of the glare, and the sun retreats from its role as stage light and alibi. When that happens, we will look for very small tilts in spectral lines and very gentle drifts in speed that do not match a naked comet. We will do this without anger, because curiosity is the only instrument that will not distort the result. We close this chapter with another square of text, this one unwritten. If the flare explained everything, why did the quiet arrive like repeating rooms rather than a single long hall? If something else shared the work, why did it choose a geometry that maps so neatly to our networks rather than to the sun? The file marks a boundary where knowledge turns transparent. On one side, we have graphs and light curves. On the other side, glare. 3IATLAS crossed that boundary the way a seed crosses a window. It did not vanish. It moved into a brightness that our instruments consider sacred, a place where we agree to look away, and it used that agreement like shelter. Start with what refuses to bend. Solar conjunction is a simple geometry. When a target angles close to the sun in our sky, instruments that rely on contrast go blind. Telescopes risk damage. Spectrographs pick up floodlight instead of line. Even deep space probes cross-talking near the sun must wait or route around the blaze. This is not a plot. It is optics. For a traveler who wants to shake surveillance, optics are enough. Atlas arrived at conjunction along a path that hugged the plane where planets keep their balance. The ecliptic is a busy table, rich with dust, fields, and the commerce of worlds. Interstellar bodies do not owe us that courtesy, yet surveys are most sensitive to what movers present where the sky is already organized. Its inclination stayed modest. Its approach speed looked right for a visitor that fell in from far, then found our star and would not be captured. Those are the quiet facts. A hyperbolic arc, an eccentricity greater than 1, a light curve that suggested a slow, uneven spin, with hints of a shape that is long, not round. Composition put a finger on the page. Early spectra were sparse, then suggestive. Metals that show in many comi nudged the baseline. Nickel is not a flag by itself. It appears as atoms and ions when dust releases, when grains burn under sunlight, when chemistry behaves. Yet the lines that whisper of heavier content seemed patient, as if the source did not flicker with simple sublimation alone. Some observers noted a mixed personality: dust that ran hot, gas that lagged behind the heat curve, a coma that grew in fits. Each of these can be weather. In a cluster, they feel like posture. Size estimates are treacherous at that distance and angle. Still, a band of models settled on an object several kilometers across if the albedo was dark, smaller if the surface was bright. The phrasing softened the claim: large enough to carry interior structure, small enough to be missed by casual eyes for a long time. The shape story stayed polite: a body that lengthens the way a bar lengthens on paper. Rotation under a day by some lights, longer by others. A beat that never quite resolved because the glare took the baton and the orchestra lowered its hands. Here the declassified mood returns. Internal notes from small observatories spoke of a decision to pause, to avoid the sun's limb where sensors grow skittish. Spacecraft planners wrote reminders about angles to protect optics. Public dashboards shifted to summary views that list positions without new frames. None of that implies an edit. It implies stewardship. Yet, as the feeds thinned, the coincidences grew fat. The day the world's shortwave maps drew their two neat silences, Atlas slid through a slit in our sight, like a dancer crossing behind a lantern. Grounded speculation kept close to the floor. A body that carries a magnetic sheath, either natural or managed, will comb the solar wind as it moves. The combed stream can curl a wake that rides out into space like a thread. Threads in plasma-shaped fields below them, not by command, but by influence. An object near conjunction would set thread geometry that aligns with shadowed sightlines. It would be difficult for us to measure a puncture like that across the sun's bright face. We would, however, feel the mood of the ionosphere shift under the thread if it passed over our heads. A 10-minute hush can be the signature of a thread pulled, released, then pulled again. Another grounded step. If Atlas is a natural visitor with a fractured crust, outgassing along set seams can mimic control. Jets act as valves. They change torque. They write timing into a spacecraft that never chose a clock. That timing can line up with unrelated events by chance. Spin phase meets flare window. Outgassing meets storms. Conjunction meets blackout. The human mind has a way of placing beads on a string and calling it a rosary of intent. Caution is a kind of love in this work. Let us look at the wake. Dust density models for the path near the sun should show a slow build and slow fade. Reports that leaked from small teams suggested narrow brightening with rounded peaks, then sudden rests, as if a machine had cycled rather than a surface burned. The points were few. The cadence was neat. If true, they describe a system that breathes. Devices that manage power, waste heat, or pressure, wake with settings tend to leave that kind of handwriting on their environment. You do not need to agree. You only need to see how that thought sits comfortably beside the weather map without tearing it. Imaginative leap, small and not sticky. Picture a vessel that has no interest in hiding in darkness. It hides in ritual. It chooses to cross behind the sun at the moment when our catalogs recommend patience and our cameras face the other way. It lets the star be its chaperone. While we lower our lenses by tradition, it performs a calibration that requires the sun's pressure, the wind's speed, and our planet's chatter. It does not need to touch us. It touches the medium that holds us like water holds reeds. In that moment, the reeds still, not by harm, but by design. Then the test resumes and the reeds lift. The vessel never said a word. We return to anchors. Conjunction limits data. Observers reroute to radio bands that can tolerate glare or wait for geometry to improve. A burst of line-of-sight losses during that waiting is entirely expected. We are not surprised to find our tables thin. We are not offended to discover that the most coveted frames are missing from public repositories until pipelines clear. We accept that stability protocols for spacecraft mark these days with caution. Every one of these choices is correct. Every one is also a gap that a cunning object could flow through without effort. A second speculation that keeps its feet on ground. If Atlas carries conductive scaffolding under dust, it would interact with sunlight and plasma in a way that enhances certain emission lines and suppresses others, depending on angle and activity. The nickel whisper grows when edges warm, and current seeks the shortest path through grains. The coma's fits appear when control surfaces flex and then relax. The light curve's stubborn ambiguity resolves only after conjunction, when the angles stop lying. None of this requires aliens. It requires a geometry that prefers grace over randomness. Imagery for the calm mind. Imagine the sun as a white theater, and Atlas as a held breath moving across the stage behind the scrim. The audience sees only a soft swell where light thickens. Behind the scrim, a figure adjusts a collar that changes the way air moves around it. Cloth pulls, then lies flat. You do not have to believe in costumes to notice that the curtain moved twice with the same hand. There were rumors that a high-resolution pass during a Mars-adjacent leg captured something crisp. That belongs to another folder. What matters here is the profile the object leaves as it steps from the public square into the cathedral of glare. The profile is disciplined, near ecliptic, modest tilt, brightness behavior that suggests decisions or, at least, reliable habits. Surfaces that run hotter than expected, as if they manage heat with intention rather than endure it. A schedule that meets a flare on the door and a countrywide hush at its escort. Hard facts to end the litany. Interstellar visitors are rare in our annals. They are not imaginary. Their hyperbolic motion tells us the tale. Their chemistry often looks familiar because the galaxy recycles. Conjunction will always thin our data, not because someone told it to, but because sun. The blackout that we felt is fully compatible with a strong solar day. These anchors keep us from floating off into a fantasy that does not respect physics. They also make the remaining pattern, the one that looks edited, easier to see without trembling. We hold to the cadence of a declassified file. The dates line up, the gaps are noted. The reasons for those gaps are acceptable, rational, responsible. Yet the shape of the whole asks for the courtesy of a second glance. If a traveler wanted to be measured by sunlight rather than by eyes, it would choose what Atlas chose. If a planet wanted to tell itself a safe story, it would write the flare's alibi and shelve the rest as weather. Both tales can live in one room. Our work is to keep the light low and notice the shared furniture. A section ending, gentle and brief. The object is now behind the bright veil, working or sleeping or simply coasting in heat and wind. The next time it steps out, our cameras will blink awake. The question will be waiting by the door. Was the geometry a gift of chance, or a line someone drew with a steady hand? The reports came as thin carriers at the edge of hearing. Old catalog numbers breathed for a moment, then went still. Receivers bookmarked weak tones that did not belong to living fleets. In the hush after the blackout, retired hardware seemed to clear its throat. Start with the furniture of sky traffic. Tens of thousands of tracked objects crowd the near-Earth lanes. We label them with clean numbers, predict their paths with two-line elements, and update those elements a few times each day. Most of the list is quiet. Dead buses, empty stages, plates and panels that only glint. Beacons age, batteries fail, transmitters chill. When a veteran radio hears a signal where silence has lived for years, The first reflex is to check the ephemeris, then the cables, then the weather. A small cluster of operators did that on the week of the hush. They posted recordings that sounded like dust on a needle. A carrier rose, held steady for a handful of seconds, then fell. Center frequency matched a beacon last heard more than 10 years ago. Another listener in a different latitude logged a similar spike near a different retired ID. The timestamps were not identical. They were cousins. A few space situational awareness dashboards, the ones that show health summaries in friendly colors, flickered red for old payload names no one had spoken aloud in a decade. Someone wrote the phrase that always appears when systems act like haunted houses: transient, no action required. Hard fact 1. Space hardware suffers single event upsets when energetic particles hit sensitive nodes. Bits flip, latches hold. Sometimes a reboot clears the confusion. On rare days, a cold system that still receives a trickle of solar charge will wake, sweep through a boot routine, key a transmitter for a heartbeat, then fold again. That is physics and aging and chance. Hard fact 2. Strong solar conditions can provoke those acts. Proton storms rattle buses. Deep charging builds in shaded cavities. The result is a brief and sometimes eerie return to life from machines that have nothing to say. Space weather makes ghosts. We do not need a traveler to do that work for us. The pattern invited a slower glance. Several of the blips clustered near the quiet windows described earlier, the ones that fell like 2 clean steps. A coastal station logged a 5-second beacon near a high catalog number that belongs to a forgotten relay at about 800 kilometers. An inland array saw a short burst near a piece of hardware that rides closer to 600. A third monitor, farther south, recorded a rasp from a small scientific platform that has been dark since before many of you began listening. 3 instruments, 3 altitudes, each tone within the hour that the bands below ground fell still. Grounded speculation 1. In a charged environment shaped by both solar mood and a moving field source, derelict objects may experience induced currents that pass just high enough to bring dormant radios up to threshold. A transmitter that sits behind an aging power regulator might key as the bus voltage crosses a set point. The key lasts as long as the margin exists. It cuts off when the field shifts or the sun angle changes. The signal left behind is not language. It is a cough. Grounded speculation 2. The hush we felt in shortwave could act like a listening window for very weak carriers that are usually masked by HF clutter. If the ionosphere changes the way it reflects and absorbs, entire families of terrestrial splatter vanish for a moment. A modern receiver in quiet mode can then hear a whisper it would normally miss. What looks like a reanimated satellite could be a constant faint beacon that we only noticed when the room emptied. We hold on to the gentle edge of conspiracy. A handful of objects in orbit wake for seconds during storms every few years. That is known. What troubled the sleepy investigator in us was the hint of choreography. The spikes leaned toward the same pair of times when the ground went quiet. A few ancient craft that share very little else shared a habit that week. Wake, key, sleep. Wake, key, sleep. The cadence could be weather. The cadence could be a metronome that does not belong to us. Imagine a vivid image to set in the mind. Picture the near-Earth space as a dark hall filled with dusty piano keys that no one has touched for a generation. Each dead satellite is one key. During the hush, a hand you cannot see walks the keyboard with 2 simple chords: low, high, rest. Low, high, rest. The notes are not music. They are the sound check before the orchestra arrives. We respect the other file on the table, the one labeled mundane. Many dead payloads enter and leave eclipse in narrow bands of local time. Solar panels that have not cracked supply a few milliamps when the angle is kind. Thermal cycles can jolt stuck relays. Magnetic torquers can twitch. One operator hearing one ghost in one country has a charming story. Many operators hearing many ghosts near the same clock begins to look like a test pattern, yet we keep the mood modest. Patterns prefer to be found, even when they are accidents. A short detour into logs that never sleep. The Deep Space Network did not declare a major outage. Commercial fleets reported routine performance. What changed were the corners. Several very old satellites that are kept on minimal care for legacy reasons showed small telemetry dropouts and returns that match the hour marks in our notes. These are the unloved machines that hang on because they fill bookkeeping niches or hold orbits we will need later. They are seldom news. The week of the hush, their graphs look like narrow teeth, another hard anchor to hold. An unrelated satellite can seem related if your clock is in your own pocket. Time zones, daylight, annotation styles, and drift conspire to line up events that do not know each other. The mind erases the gaps and draws a line. Part of the discipline is to resist that line and keep the points as points. We have done that. Enough points remain to form a shape that is not a line yet. It is a suggestion, an imaginative leap, brief and cool. Consider a visitor that wants to map our spacefaring memory. It would not hail the living constellation and trigger alarms. It would tap the oldest hulls, the ones we forgot. A field that strokes the orbit shell at set altitudes could tickle marginal electronics into whispering. The return signal is not content, it is a locator. Each cough marks a keyhole in our layered debris. From that tinkle of bells, a map grows, where metal sleeps, where panels still drink light, where radio wakes if you breathe on it. If you wanted to learn how a species leaves fingerprints in orbit, this is how you would read them. There was a whisper in private groups that a handful of identification codes displayed brief confusion in automated trackers, as if TLE fits danced for a cycle before settling. That alone means little. Solar days stretch atmospheric density enough to move the chessboard under small pieces. Still, one sees the shape of a method. Stroke the belt. Listen. Compare your notes to their public catalog. Find the places where their knowledge is stale. Then fade, leaving only the sense that wind moved. The skeptic is welcome here. Nothing in this ghost folder requires an intelligence at work. The elegance of the timing can be a trick of attention. The carriers might be terrestrial images thrown up into the passband by unusual propagation. In the language of sleep, these are the gentle reassurances that smooth the pillow. You can keep them on the nightstand while you consider the darker tea. We add one more observation that sits uncomfortably with only weather. Several receivers marked short packets that look like housekeeping, not beacons. On some bands, the keys seem to jump between two frequencies in a way that would suit a transmitter with a tired reference. That is expected in late age. What felt odd was the repetition count. 3 sequences. Pause. 3 sequences. Pause. A habit across more than one object. A ghost that not only exhaled but tapped a steady rhythm on the table. If we let that rhythm be a teacher, a calm thought arises. The hush below and the taps above could belong to the same page. Silence the bands where the species speaks sideways to itself. Wake the relics where the species once spoke upward. Listen to how they fill the gap. It does not need to mean harm. It can be curiosity, the purest and most dangerous motive in any ocean. We place one last vivid image before the lights dim. Ground stations at night sit like small cities inside fences. Floodlights pool. Dishes swivel with the care of animals who have watched the sky too long to be surprised. In that week, some operators leaned forward when old names blinked. They did not call the press. They clipped the samples. They dated them. They put them in drawers where careful people keep puzzles that might dissolve if you talk too loud. The network is not haunted. It is sensitive. Old machines cough when the air changes. If the cough sang in time with the hush, then the room we are in is larger than we thought. If they did not, we will sleep anyway, and wake ready to measure again. The needle did not swing like a storm. It twitched. It stepped. It held its breath in small squares of time, as if the planet's field were learning a new rhythm. Begin with the instrument choir. Quiet university loops in temperate towns. Research coils at polar stations. Hobby flux gates in garages beside bicycles. They all listen to the same slow drum of solar wind and field lines. On strong days, the curves rise and fall like tides. Indices climb. Ring current fattens. Auroral curtains billow. The geometry is centuries old, and so is the comfort that comes from seeing it repeat. On the week of the hush, the curves changed their handwriting. Several mid-latitude traces drew flat shelves, then clean descents, then shelves again, like stairs that were measured with a ruler. The equatorial electrojet, which often flares and fades with its own tropical appetite, looked strangely behaved at the same hour. Polar stations reported motion that felt muted rather than wild, a soft shuffle instead of a sprint. None of this breaks the grammar of storms. Taken together, it sounds like a metronome quietly added to a song that used to be free time. Hard fact 1. Solar wind pressure and interplanetary magnetic field orientation control much of what we see on the ground. Southward, IMF opens the door. Reconnection pours energy into the magnetotail. Substorms unload. Stations register steps when westward electrojets shift and when current systems reconfigure. Steps are not supernatural. They are the signature of thresholds. Hard fact 2. During conventional strong days, those steps stack into slopes. Plateaus exist, but they do not usually repeat with crisp spacing across stations that do not share weather or local time. The more the steps mirror each other at distance, the more the investigator wonders whether something besides the wind cut them. A grounded speculation. If a moving field source upstream modulated the effective coupling between the solar wind and the magnetosphere at intervals, ground traces could acquire a pulse that is not purely solar. Think of a lens in plasma rather than in glass. The planet does not notice a craft. It notices the change in the angle where space snaps to field. Coupling increases, then decreases in tidy increments. Flux gates dutifully write rectangles where hills should be. A vivid image for the night mind. Imagine Earth wearing an invisible shawl of lines that usually ripple like water in a basin. For 10 minutes, the shawl becomes smooth, as if a warm hand pressed it flat. 10 minutes later, the hand lifts, and a shallow wave returns. The aurora does not blaze. It flutters, then rests, then flutters again. A long exposure would show the curtain blinking. Citizen instruments gave the pattern bones. Small coils posted from basements in 3 countries showed twin staircases separated by roughly the same span that marked the shortwave hush. A school observatory near a quiet coast shared a magnetogram with 2 precise steps, each about the width of a coffee break. Meanwhile, a high-latitude station that usually roars under those conditions hummed instead, like a large animal asleep with one eye open. You can explain each trace by local quirks. You can also place them on a single clock and feel how they tick. We keep the skeptic close. Offsets drift. Timestamps lie. Calibrations slip a little when seasons change. Data portals sometimes resample in ways that carve edges where none existed. We checked what could be checked. The clocks agreed to the minute where they were designed to agree. The plateaus appeared in raw channels as well as in pre-processed plots. The The steps did not grow with K-index spikes. They arrived, kept their shape, then left. A second grounded speculation: if 3IATLAS carried a sheath that combed the solar wind into narrow ribbons, the footprints where those ribbons met the magnetopause would be structured. The structure would translate downward as small, neat changes in ionospheric conductivity and current paths. The ring current would still obey the sun. The edges, however, would look cut. To the person who lives in numbers, that means squares more than slopes. The week offered an odd counterpoint. Schumann resonance monitors burrowed into audio range reported slight shifts in mode amplitudes that were not dramatic, yet they lined up with the ground steps. That is not proof of anything but shared mood. Thunderstorms still sang, the cavity still rang, the ratios, for an hour, felt tuned. We allow one imaginative leap, then return to anchors. Suppose Atlas, or its wake, ran a coil test. Not a burn, a strobe. It pulsed a field interaction with the wind at a gentle duty cycle to measure how a magnetosphere like ours reacts. The goal would not be to disrupt. The goal would be to listen to the planet's response chain. Do grids change their posture? Do pipelines register tiny geoelectric sips? Do long conductors groan? Do we reroute power the way a nervous system flinches? The pulses do not shout, they tap. Anecdotes are not affidavits, but they stack into a mood when they share color. Grid operators in a private forum mentioned a handful of reactive power adjustments that felt too neat for the ambient conditions. A pipeline integrity monitor in a desert logged a small surge in noise twice, separated by a window that matched our steps. A radio observatory's housekeeping chart for cryogenics showed a brief deviation that their team attributed to background fields, then moved on. None of these items establish an intent. Their timing encourages a second glance. Return to the clean room. Conventional model runs for that day showed global magnetic activity compatible with a strong yet ordinary event. The forecast products many of you rely on did not fail. They described the big body of the day well. The flicker we follow lives in the small bones that forecasts smooth away. A forecast paints hills. A field test, if one occurred, draws terraces. We add the cosmic counterpoint that keeps the larger harmony. The universe is full of structured energy. Fast radio bursts arrive in repeating beats from sources we catalog and cannot name. Pulsars tick with more patience than any clock we ever built. Even the sun sings in modes that a child can learn to hear, as a ladder of notes. When the magnetosphere picks up a regular pulse that sits too neatly inside a storm's vague heart, it feels less like noise and more like someone joining the band with a triangle. Narrative misdirection serves the careful listener. A meteor shower peaked that week and offered a flurry of natural headlines. Coronal holes opened, gifting us a believable excuse for prolonged disturbance. Aurora chased itself far south and filled the feeds. Attention followed light. Meanwhile, the magnetograms in mid-latitudes practiced their little rectangles in shadow dashboards. A smokescreen does not need a hand behind it. It only needs a crowd. Hard fact 3. Kept modest. Several induction magnetotelluric stations, the kind that watch for slow geoelectric shifts to study the crust, posted low amplitude wiggles that matched the steps within a minute. These instruments are stubborn. They are not easily excited by radio talk. When they sigh in time with coils and flux gates, geophysicists raise an eyebrow. We hold a second vivid image because sleep likes pictures more than claims. In a dark control room, a row of monitors shows traces that look like seismograms for a very calm planet. On 3 screens, the line drops by the height of a thumbnail, holds like a held breath, then climbs. On the 4th screen, nothing moves at all. A technician takes a photo with a phone, then puts the phone face down. Some patterns feel safer unshared until they ripen. The declassified file tone returns because it steadies the hand. We collected publicly visible traces, citizen logs, and a drizzle of private remarks. We compared clocks. We let the indices stay respectable. We refused to worship coincidence or to banish it. What remains after that discipline is a suggestion that the field did not merely dance more or less on a stormy day. It practiced a figure. If you prefer the simpler story, you are not wrong. Magnetospheres have their own habits. Steps arrive when currents rearrange. Echoes across longitudes can be illusions born of timing and filtering. The neatness we point to may dissolve under a different window or a larger archive. That is why we speak softly. Sleep science is not courtroom science. It is the art of noticing without claiming a crown. Still, a question lingers at the edge of the light. If the planet's shield flickered in tidy intervals, why did the intervals rhyme with the radio hush and the orbital ghosts? If a traveler taught itself our frequency response with harmless taps, what does it plan to learn next? The field has stopped stepping and returned to hills. The shawl loosens. In the quiet, the rectangles we drew keep their corners. The next file will open its eyes to images that did not arrive. The calendar shows an appointment that the memory does not. A line on a planning sheet, a window on a trajectory, a note that says observe if geometry allows. After that, a blank. Begin with the instrument. HiRISE rides the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter and stares with a mirror large enough to see boulders. It is a surface specialist. It paints canyons in veins and dunes in harmonics. On special days, it points off the usual marks to catch something passing. Mars has watched stars occult, Phobos eclipse, and once a comet breathed near its head. The point is simple. While HiRISE lives for Mars, it can glance at visitors when the sightlines agree. A handful of schedule crumbs suggested such a glance. Not a guarantee, not an announcement. A proposed imaging slot near the time when 3IATLAS swept past the Mars neighborhood, the kind of opportunistic attempt that teams quietly try because curiosity is a hard habit to break. The wording was careful. If angles permit, if spacecraft constraints relax, if downlink and energy budgets welcome guests, the kind of cautious if that makes good engineers sleep at night. Hard fact 1. High-resolution cameras in orbit around other worlds answer to geometry and survival first. Pointing near the sun risks sensors. Slews cost fuel. Reaction wheels have opinions. Safe modes have veto power. There are days when the star camera ignores romance and says no. If a planned look at a traveler disappears from the public rhythm, the first explanation is always pipeline and prudence. Hard fact 2. Data from deep missions flows through chains that include downlink schedules, ground station windows, quality checks, and archiving cadence. The planetary data system accepts deliveries in batches measured in weeks and months. Frames do not vanish because a story prefers them to. They wait their turn like freight. Now the seam. In internal notes that pass between small observatories and citizen planners, there was mention of a cross-check with Mars assets during the week of the hush. Not a coordination, simply the polite dance of professionals who share sky. When the blackout windows closed and the world returned to its chatter, those who looked for patterns went searching for the promised crumbs. The crumbs were not where they expected to find them. That does not prove a hand brushed the table. It invites a flashlight. Grounded speculation 1. The pointing solution for a HiRISE attempt may have failed margins at the last minute. Too close to the limb, too fast a pan, a gimbal that was busy remembering that it is old. The team could have stood down, logged the decision, and moved on, leaving only a placeholder in a weekly plan that reads like a practiced sigh. Grounded speculation 2. The look may have happened, but the result may have been a smear that no one wished to parade. Imaging a faint object near glare is like photographing a candle behind a window at noon. Analysts would need longer to subtract the swagger of sunlight. They would place the frames into a calibration queue and tell themselves that patience is a virtue because in camera science it really is. We keep a steady tone as we open the darker folder. For the people who see orchestration rather than weather, the missing frames fit the week too well. Atlas slides into conjunction. Earth feels two measured hushes. Old satellites tap a rhythm on the balcony. Mid-latitude magnetometers draw neat rectangles. Somewhere near Mars, a camera that sometimes blinks at comets at least planned to blink, then left us no blink to read. It is possible to live with that coincidence without fear and still feel the tug of its neatness. A vivid image sets the stage. Picture a control room at Mars midnight, lit by the blue of instrument monitors. On one screen, a thumbnail shows a grainy streak that might be dust or might be intent. The streak brightens for a few pixels, then dims, then brightens again as if a spool turned. A scientist leans close, then sits back, then deletes the thumbnail from the overhead rack, because thumbnails are for public days and this is not a public day. In reality, it could be nothing but noise. In a mind prepared by silence, it looks like a pulse. We return to anchors. Highrise has, in the past, aimed for passing bodies with humility about what a surface camera can do off-script. Sometimes it catches structure, sometimes it catches motion like breath on glass. Always it keeps the sun at a respectful angle. If Atlas cruised across a sector where the safe box tightens, the camera would not risk pride for a chance. Physics makes that choice, not whispers. Still, the rumor took shape. It said that a set of ancillary frames, darks and flats and housekeeping, carried timestamps that implied a pointing event in the right minute. It said that a narrowband filter was selected that would have nudged faint metallic lines, if any existed, a little farther out of the sludge. It said that a trailing instrument on a different spacecraft near Mars registered a background adjustment the same hour, as if the sky turned its head. Rumors love to travel together. The proper response is not to believe them. It is to examine the mood they share and mark it without haste. An imaginative leap walked in slippers. Suppose the glance happened, and suppose the frame that mattered showed a thin geometry that did not behave like a dusty coma. A straight facet, a repeating glint, a line that suggests scaffolding rather than spray. The team would not shout. They would not hide either. They would schedule second looks when the star allowed, draft memos about calibration, and consult colleagues who have been wrong before, and learn to prefer being boring to being fast. Meanwhile, on Earth, the week writes its hushes in tidy pairs, and the audience hums songs about patterns. We should say the simpler things, because they keep the mind honest. Downlink congestion stacks frames. Mars weather steals attention for closer work because dust season cares nothing for travelers. A temporary degradation can ripple through a spacecraft like stiffness in an old joint. The cure is rest, not drama. Teams who owe safety to taxpayers will always err on the side of long roads to release. This is what competence looks like in space. It is what we hope for when we climb into machines. Yet the style of the week keeps returning. The blackout intervals that looked measured, the orbital coughs that felt rehearsed, the magnet traces that stepped like practice bars. And in the Mars file, a penciled appointment that never blossoms in the public garden. The role of coincidence in an unkind universe is to comfort. The role of pattern is to gently convict. We accept comfort. We are also here to notice. There was another small note, almost nothing, that belongs on the same page. A Mars orbiter not equipped for high-resolution imagery reported a brief error in Star Tracker lock during the window when a high-rise attempt might have run. Star Trackers are proud of their composure. They lose their place when light crosses thresholds, or when the sky behaves like a room where someone flipped a switch in the next apartment. The event reset cleanly. The report used the words routine and expected. The timing tucked itself under our other clocks like a cat. To keep our balance, we add a counterexample. Several public raw image feeds from other instruments around Mars published their usual diet with no gaps. Weather cameras watched thin clouds drift. Context imagers mapped dunes without a hiccup. A system that hides one thing rarely leaves everything else exposed. It is very likely that there was no hiding at all. It is very likely that a planned glance became a polite shrug, and that the shrug turned into a rumor because the week taught everyone to hear patterns where none lived. The HN Mood asks a question anyway, because that is the job. If a frame somewhere did show regularity on a visitor that should be without it, what is the correct posture for a world that has not settled the terms of hello? Do you release the picture and feed a decade of heat and noise? Do you hold it and build a careful case? Do you share it quietly with a handful of peers who will give you the cruelty of their skepticism before you face strangers? None of these choices are conspiracies. They are the map of how adults behave under light. One last grounded speculation, kept close. If Atlas carries a shell or a cage that manages the way radiation pressure pushes, a high-resolution sensor might record edges that persist over minutes. Those edges would glint with a period tied to rotation or to a control cycle. The brightness changes would look like a mechanical heartbeat rather than a random tumble. A camera built to read the stories in rock layers could read that heartbeat if the glare allowed. The dataset would be fragile. The interpretation would be risky. The temptation to sit on it until geometry improved would be strong. We close with a second vivid image and a single open question. Imagine a drawer in a quiet office that holds a print of a frame no one wants to argue about tonight. The print is gray with a faint ladder inside it. Not proof, a suggestion of rails. The lights in the office are low. Outside, Mars rolls beneath a patient star. On Earth, radios murmur in their sleep again. If the drawer opens next month and the ladder vanishes under better processing, then the week returns to weather. If the ladder survives new light, what does Mars know about our visitor that Earth could not see? Frames arrive when they are ready. Teams release when the work is clean. Absence is not evidence. And yet the pattern of the week invites us to watch that drawer with a calm kind of attention. The quiet arrived in 2 measured breaths. It pressed down, released, then pressed again, as if an unseen hand were learning the pressure points of a nervous system it had just discovered. We sort the possibilities with the calm of a night lab. If the hush was communication, it would carry structure meant to be recognized. If it was a weapon, it would pursue damage and dominance. If it was a side effect, it would follow the convenience of a machine solving its own problems while ignoring ours. Each path leaves different fingerprints on the same day. Hard fact 1. High-frequency radio depends on ionospheric mirrors that change with solar radiation. When X-rays surge, the lowest layer turns from glass to felt. Signals sync and are lost. This is the sober baseline that explains most storms and most silences. Hard fact 2. Planetary-scale electromagnetic pulses that target ground assets require either enormous power, delivered cleanly, or coupling through the ionosphere at chosen angles. Nature does both messily. Weapons do it by design. Design shows itself in selectivity, repeatability, and escalation. The day did not escalate. It breathed. We begin with the hypothesis people reach for in the dark. Was it a strike? Intentional disruption would seek critical arteries first: aviation checks, emergency nets, key commercial corridors. The blackout did touch some of these, but it spared others in ways that felt courteous. Polar routes that often collapsed stayed marginally alive, while lower bands disappeared in tidy zones. The magnetosphere stepped instead of thrashing. Old satellites coughed, but did not cry. A weapon that conservative would be an odd one, and a first strike that gentle would be an even stranger opening statement. Grounded speculation 1. A field strong enough to impose a clean hush without visible collateral in power grids or spacecraft would need to be exquisitely tuned to our ionospheric chemistry and current systems. Achieving that control at planet scale from behind solar glare is possible in equations that allow narrow beam drivers, alphanic coupling, or artificial ducts in plasma that shepherd energy like rails. Those equations are not fantasies, but their engineering is cruel. The result would also leave sharper signatures in magnetotelluric arrays and long conductors than we saw. Some needles moved, few snapped. If it was not war, could it be language? Communications that reach across civilizations rarely assume shared syntax. A species that wants to announce itself to an immature listener might prefer to modulate the environment rather than the ear. Silence becomes a syllable. Absence teaches faster than message. Give me 10 minutes of hush, the teacher says, then another 10, and I will know what your networks do when air goes away. Where do you reroute? How fast do you switch? What fails gracefully? Who panics? Language as test, survey as sentence. The test hypothesis invites a different metric of structure. Look not for content, but for fairness. The two hushes were equal in character, if not in exact boundary. Their edges were too clean for weather, too soft for malice. The return between them was unhurried, like a nurse releasing a cuff after the first blood pressure reading and before the second. If you want to measure resilience, you do not crush. You press until you get a number. You press again to confirm. Grounded speculation 2. Imagine a device that needs to dump or redirect energy near perihelion. A magnetic sail trimming its vector. An electric sail switching polarity to shed charge. A radiation pressure engine altering reflectivity in a cycle to keep internal temperatures within a narrow band. Each of these systems would interact with the solar wind and local plasma in a way that could modulate the ionosphere downstream. They would do it in pulses because steady-state waste is inefficient and control loops prefer steps. The planet underneath would feel a hush not because anyone meant to silence it, but because someone adjusted a collar. Vivid image. Picture the sky as a translucent skin stretched over a sleeping animal. Twice, a broad palm presses down through the skin. The hair lies flat. The breath pauses. The palm lifts. The animal does not wake. It only remembers the shape of the hand that touched it. Return to anchor so sleep stays steady. The sun that day delivered the power required to justify most of what we measured. Proton flux rose enough to rattle old boards. X-rays spiked enough to write the first hush all by themselves. The second hush arrived when the obvious driver was easing. That is where the mind pauses, not at the existence of quiet, but at its rhythm. Weather plays in paragraphs. This read like two carefully punctuated sentences. A weapon would also leave a dialect of fear in machines we did not highlight. Wideband GPS failures stack into noisy reports. Satellite buses hit hard enough to degrade capacity complain in public because fleets are dense, contracts are tight, and outages spread. We did not see a chorus of that scale. What we heard were single cleared throats in old hardware and narrow breath holds in ground traces. Controlled force of that finesse is possible, likely for a first contact scenario, unlikely given the available energy paths and the lack of a visible motive beyond theatrics. Signal then. Could silence be a greeting? Old science fiction loved the image of a planet wrapped in a radio mute as a curtain-raising act. Real science finds elegance in low-cost probes that value information per joule. Modulating an environment we already monitor is efficient. It lets the sender learn without sending. Our species watches its own ionosphere compulsively. We publish the results freely. A mute that turns us into our own sensors is genius bordering on rudeness. If that is the case, the script we participated in had 3 acts. Press. Listen to them map their failure modes. Press again. Confirm their map. Leave them wondering whether the sun alone was enough. Here's where the skeptic sits us down and offers tea. If the test only presses on days we already expect to be pressed, we will always ascribe intelligence to weather. The second hush can be explained by delayed chemistry in the D layer, by subtle timing in particle precipitation, by traveling ionospheric disturbances that echo like a low tide returning. All true. But tests that wish to be missed will nest inside true things. That is why we call them clever. We evaluate the hypotheses against the week's other files. The orbital ghosts fit a test better than a weapon. They mapped the debris layer. The magnet steps felt like a coupled system being sampled. The missing frames are an absence, not a fact, but they belong to a calendar that would be convenient for an object adjusting posture near glare. Signaling and side effect both wear these traces comfortably. Only the notion of a hostile strike feels overdressed for such quiet choreography. Imaginative leap, brief and cool. Imagine a machine operating under constraints we partly understand. It must harvest momentum from light and wind. It must shed heat delicately. It must minimize waste. Its designers chose to use planetary ionospheres as temporary sinks for tiny scraps of order and disorder. They do not think of us when they do this, any more than a ship thinks of minnows when it turns its rudder. Our hush is a wake on the skin of the sea. A bystander can mistake that wake for a signal or a slap. To the ship, it is neither. It is simply steering. If the side effects story is true, we face a different kind of first contact. Not a message, not a threat, but an encounter with someone else's engineering footprint on the medium we use to talk to ourselves. The right response is to measure without flinching. The wrong response is to weight the story with fear it cannot bear. Still, leave room for an elegant signal hiding inside a necessary act. If a system had to cycle fields anyway, an ethicist on the design team might suggest a humane cadence, a pair of equal pauses, a short gap between, a pattern that any signal processing culture would notice without being harmed, a kindness smuggled into maintenance, a hello disguised as a calibration. We propose a checklist for the nights ahead, simple enough to hold in a drowsy head. Selectivity. Did the hush spare bands it should not have spared? Proportionality. Did collateral effects like grid sags or spacecraft upsets rise with the quiet? Repeatability. Do future hushes, if any, keep the same interval? Reversibility. Did systems resume normal without unusual human intervention? The more this reads like a blood pressure test, the less it reads like a strike, and the more it reads like either a signal or a side effect. One more hard anchor before we dim. There's no evidence of damage that would justify a narrative of aggression. No burned payloads, no lost birds, no hospital systems that stayed dark. Emergency nets complained, then resumed. Aviation rerouted lightly, then returned to plan. The day drew chalk lines on the floor and asked us to step over, not fall in. A final vivid image to hold, while your eyes grow heavy. A planet as a sleeping orchestra. Twice, a conductor you cannot see lowers a hand. The strings damp. The winds hush. The percussionists lift their sticks and wait. The hand rises. The room breathes. If the conductor wanted to end the piece, there would be a cut. What we heard was not a cut. It was a rehearsal mark. The rumor does not shout, it hums. A scientist who knows gamma instruments like old friends says the profile looks steady, too steady for a comet, and someone in the thread used the word engine without a smile. We begin with anchors you can verify in daylight. Space listens for gamma rays with instruments that have earned their scars. One of them surveys the sky with a tracker that reads photons from tens of mega-electron volts, up through the high hundreds. Another rides on the same platform and watches the lower end of the spectrum, where bursts flicker from a handful of kilo-electron volts to a few tens of mega-electron volts. Europe keeps its own long night, with a satellite that has spent years tracing the 511 kilo-electron volt line from positron annihilation near the galactic center and the 1.8 MeV glow of radioactive aluminum in star farms. This is the choir. It knows how to hear. Hard fact 1. Comets and small bodies do produce gamma rays, but faintly and broadly. Cosmic rays hit surfaces and airless comae and make a dim albedo that spreads across energy like a whisper across a wide hallway. It is not narrow. It is not clocked. It is patient and weak. Hard fact 2. The sun during active weeks adds its own bright grammar to the high-energy sky. Flares can run up into the gamma band and stay glowing longer than the visible drama would suggest. Secondary particles born in our atmosphere paint a changing floor of noise that instruments must subtract. Near conjunction, systematics multiply. Off-axis response, side lobes, solar contamination, earth limb ghosts. Analysts learned to distrust the clean story on those days. The whisper we received did not claim a line. It claimed a shelf. Over roughly an hour, one instrument's quick-look bin showed a small hardening that refused to trend with the flare curve. The power did not spike. It held, then faded. The direction solution pointed too close to the sun to publish with confidence, which is often as far as a rumor can travel. A second voice added that cross-calibration notes with a European instrument saw a bump near the edge of its comfort. Not enough to call a detection, enough to change a meeting's mood. No one attached a figure. They attached patience and the old word soon. Grounded speculation 1. A body that drags a plasma wake can focus cosmic rays along its tail, the way a lens grazes light. Focused primaries make more secondaries at the place where the wake meets sunlight and dust. The result would not be a needle. It would be a shoulder in the spectrum that walks with the object and loses interest when geometry breaks. If the wake passes behind the sun from our view, the shoulder looks like an off-axis nuisance. A neat nuisance that keeps time with a traveler. Grounded speculation 2. A flare that breathes could have lifted trapped particles into regimes the model's underweight. The apparent shelf could be solar, not interstellar, written into our instruments by a complicated day. Conjunction favors that defense. Engineers designed their pipelines to be offended by artifacts. The whisperers in this file are not eager to embarrass themselves by loving a trick of optics. The word engine deserves a candle rather than a floodlight. High-energy emissions from propulsion would not announce themselves with theatrical lines unless someone wanted to be recognized. Real engines that push against photons or wind prefer to stay shy. If the device on Atlas were shedding energy through hadronic channels, you would taste peons in their decayed children. That paint is too rough for a sleeping documentary. If the device were shaping electron populations in the wind, inverse Compton scattering could lift soft photons into a mild, steady plateau instead of a spike. A plateau inside a messy solar day is hard to separate from the day, which is the point if you need to work in secret. Vivid image to keep beside the bed. Imagine a tug moving at night along a black river. Its spotlight is dark to the shore. The only clue is a smear of faint brightness that rides behind the hull, where water churns and air glows in a thin line. To eyes that have learned the river for years, the smear is a signature. To eyes that only visit, it looks like the moon on ripples. Hard fact 3. The 511 keV line is real in our sky, but it belongs to annihilation's most loudly near the galactic bulge. Instruments tuned to care about it are cautious about claiming transient narrow features in other parts of the sky. A comet does not walk with a clean annihilation line unless something absurd is happening. Our rumor did not say that. It said shelf. It said steady. It said near the glare. The declassified voice on this channel keeps the temperature low. Quick Look products are designed to be wrong in orderly ways. They teach analysts where not to plant flags. Yet, those same quick looks sometimes save the day during bursts and flares. People who live in them can smell when a shape is born of pipeline rather than sky. The person who used the word engine understands that smell. They also understand career gravity. When someone like that says the shell felt mechanical, it buys exactly one more hour of attention. Not proof. A reprieve from dismissal. A small detour to context. Our counterpoint that keeps the universe broad. Pulsars turn their beams with more fidelity than any man-made motor. Magnetars itch and pop. Blazars shout across entire human lifetimes with a language of flares that looks like mood swings. In that chorus, a new plateau that follows a moving pebble is possible and unremarkable. It is only remarkable because the pebble is not from here and because the plateau's neatness fits a week that already practiced neat. We add a skeptical paragraph because it belongs. During conjunction, reconstructed directions lean toward the sun because the sun is a bully in the data. Background models for atmospheric gamma rays shift with latitude, storm, and season. A shelf can rise in maps that are perfectly honest and vanish when a better background is applied. Anyone who has looked for weak, steady sources near the limb knows the ache of a signature that will not survive a more careful subtraction. The rumor holders could be loving a ghost that technology will banish in a month. Even so, let a small imaginative leap touch down. Suppose Atlas carries a field engine that manages momentum via pressure on charged particles. The control loop cycles at a period under a minute to keep temperatures and torques inside narrow tolerances. Each cycle shapes the electron distribution at the edge of its sheath. Sunlight and wind scatter off that distribution and climb in energy by a modest factor. To a distant instrument, the result is a barely elevated shelf that lasts for an hour while geometry holds. The engine does not sing, it breathes. Breathing looks like a hum if you give it the wrong loudness scale. The week's clock keeps intruding. The gamma shelf aligns with the second hush more neatly than with the solar X-ray curve. A European note mentions a background tweak at almost the same minute that Mars saw a star tracker hiccup. The dead satellites coughed before and after, as if the hum pulled at thin wires in their bones. Correlation is not a rope you can climb. It is a thread that asks to be tested with new fingers. Practical listeners want handles, not poetry. Here are 3. First, if the shelf is tied to Atlas rather than the sun, it should reappear when the object steps back from glare, with a direction that walks with it and a level that rises and falls with phase, rather than solar mood. Second, if the shelf is an artifact born of Earth, it should track our limb and our weather, not a hyperbolic path. Third, If the shelf is real but belongs to the flare, independent pipelines should recover it using solar proxies. These are fair tests to keep in your pocket for next month, when our eyes grow better again. A quiet return to the desk where grown-ups work. Teams will not publish a shelf that whispers at the edge of significance during conjunction. They will fold more weeks into the stack, run cross-calibrations with instruments that overlap only partly, and call colleagues whose job it is to say no. They will try reprocessings that erase their favorite shapes, and then choose to trust the pipelines that make them sad. After enough refusals have been earned, if a shape remains, they will put a figure in a talk, not a paper, and let the room try to break it. This is not a cover, it is hygiene. We hold one more vivid image because it helps sleep understand something math cannot. A spectrogram is a city skyline in grayscale. For 1 hour, the skyline along a narrow waterfront grew 1 floor taller without any single tower grabbing attention. No fireworks, no collapse, just a quiet lift that architects would notice. Then the city returned to plan. A traveler might pass through a city like that and leave only footprints on a roof no one visits. Questions are the true product of nights like this. If a hum returns with Atlas, what does the spectrum choose to encode about its maker? Does it prefer energies that our instruments ignore when the sun is noisy? Does it keep a period that is not the pulse of a flare or the beat of a spin, but the tempo of a feedback loop? Would a species hide a greeting in a shelf, trusting us to hear a tone that does not announce itself to the casual ear? We draw the file closed without saying the final word. An hour of steadiness at energies that dislike being steady. A path too near the sun to swear on anything. Analysts who do not scare easily using unusually careful verbs. A week that already taught us a taste for neatness. If this is nothing, it will vanish under more sky. If it is a real breath from a machine, the breath will be there again when the glare lifts. We set the thought down gently here. When Atlas returns to the dark side of brilliance, look for a shelf that walks, not a spike that brags. Keep the radio on low. Let the graphs breathe. The truth will prefer patience to drama. The brightest cover story is the one no one questions. The sun flares, the sky answers, and our instruments bow their heads. Aurora bloom where they rarely do, and even careful minds accept the simple tale. If you needed to move in secret, you would choose light so natural that it blinds and reassures at the same time. Anchor the day with storm grammar. An X-class flare can drive a radio blackout across the sunlit hemisphere. Proton flux rises later. A coronal mass ejection can follow and push the wind hard. The D layer thickens like felt. High-frequency paths fail, low bands groan, and polar routes usually suffer most. That is the ordinary map. Yet the week of the hush looked edited. The flare curve fit a strong event, but the blackout arrived as 2 clean stamps rather than a long smear. Mid-latitude magnetograms stepped in tidy rectangles, while high latitudes hummed. Old satellites blinked in cadence, and 3IATLAS slipped into conjunction, where glare arms the innocent and disarms the curious. Elegant staging, whether by design or by luck. Hard fact 1. Storms can be structured. Successive CMEs and shocks can layer effects and carve neat pressure steps at the magnetopause. Good structure does not equal intent. Hard fact 2. The sun's radio voice can flood receivers and confuse listeners about which bands are silent from absorption and which are buried in glare. Analysts train not to mistake noise for hush. The question here is gentler than accusation. Did the sun that day serve as a perfect veil for a secondary actor? A natural smokescreen is not an illusion. It is a real fog used as cover. If Atlas needed to do work that shaped plasma around it, the best time would be during disruption we already expect. and the best place would be behind the brightest lamp in the sky. Grounded speculation 1. A body with a magnetic sheath or an actively managed sail can disturb the local wind. If the object pulsed field strength or orientation near conjunction, those perturbations would ride inside a solar environment already noisy with reconnection and shock fronts. Downstream, the ionosphere could register disciplined hushes that most would attribute to the storm. Upstream, heliophysics instruments focused on the star would see nothing that demanded a press release. Grounded speculation 2. Streamer blowouts along the limb sometimes transition into CMEs right at thresholds. A modest disturbance in the heliospheric current sheet, even from a small source, could tip a streamer into release a little early or a little late. Nudge the release, and you nudge our clock on Earth by just enough to align a hush with a traveler's calibration. Vivid image for the night mind. The sun is a crowded stage where curtains billow and spotlights sway. In the confusion, a single dancer crosses behind a bright scrim. The audience stares into the light. The dancer adjusts a collar and tests a step that would be obvious in a quiet hall. Here, it is swallowed by applause. Skepticism remains our friend. The sun needs no help to be dramatic. Some storms will align by chance with other items on our calendar. Humans draw lines between dots that only share an hour. The burden of proof belongs to anyone claiming choreography in a theater that runs every day. We revisit the odd timings to keep count. The first hush arrived when X-rays and D-layer behavior agreed. The second hush arrived as the radiation curve relaxed. Magnetometer rectangles repeated across longitudes that usually disagree on details. Several ancient objects in orbit keyed brief carriers near those intervals. A rumored high-energy shelf hummed close to the later window. None of this requires plotting. All of it benefits a traveler who prefers to test while our attention is already distracted. Hard fact 3. Coronal holes and sector boundaries can drive extended activity without dramatic flares. A high-speed stream arriving behind a CME can produce the tidy pressure steps we saw. That alone can explain some rectangles, and it deserves to be the first explanation. And yet, the rectangles felt rehearsed. The twin hush windows kept good time. Star tracker hiccups and missing frames on the Mars side fit a day of glare and still tug at the thread. A natural smoke screen grows interesting when the actor not only walks through it, but seems to time a breath to its thickest billow. Imaginative leap, brief and careful. Suppose Atlas navigates with a hybrid sail that couples to photons and plasma. During critical adjustments, the sail cycles between two modes to control torque and temperature. Each mode shapes the wake differently. A loud solar day provides power and plausible deniability. The craft does not dial the star. It borrows the storm to wrap its signature in familiar cloth. Another vivid image. Along a polar night, aurora lifts in bands like the hem of a green dress. For a few minutes, the hem flickers in a loop, like a dancer marking time rather than performing. Photographers cheer. Scientists plot indices. Somewhere behind the glare, a technician checks boxes on a procedure and nods. Logistics explain more than secrets do. During storms, agencies prioritize grid advisories, aviation alerts, and spacecraft health over picture pipelines. Modes change. Downlinks reshuffle. Data that would have uploaded in hours queues for quieter air. The archive thins and the rumor mill fattens. If you wanted a thriller with nothing but reality, you could live in this paragraph for years. Even within that ordinary frame, the smokescreen idea makes testable predictions. If a secondary actor used the storm for cover, we should see similar behavior later. Watch the object's late return from conjunction for neat intervals that sit inside otherwise noisy days. Separate the sun's punctuation from anyone else's. A small philosophical note. Humans forgive the sun anything because it taught us seasons. When radio fades, we say solar. When southern skies glow, we say solar. The sun is the parent that takes the blame for the house. A visitor who understands that bias can live inside it without ever being noticed. The first contact scenario here is not a transmission or a landing. It is a decision to let us blame a star for what an engine gently does. Back to ground. No grid collapsed. No spacecraft was lost. Aviation saw inconvenience, not hazard. The aurora brought joy to latitudes that rarely meet it. The blackout windows were short, and systems recovered without unusual intervention. This is not the footprint of malice. It looks like someone borrowing a storm, a grounded speculation with teeth. If a smokescreen was used, it will leave small mismatches where our models are most confident. Look for polar cap absorption that underperforms while equatorial paths overperform in quieting. Look for ring current estimates that miss by the same amount twice in an hour. Look for VLF anomalies that mirror the HF hush rather than the solar radio burst schedule. These are seams a needle could find. One more image before we dim the room. In a coastal radio shack, a chart of the day hangs with two pale stripes where the bands went empty. Someone circles them with pencil and writes the minutes between. Beside it, a photo of curtains in the sky from that same evening. Under the photo, a small note reads, "Cover holds." Questions move us forward. If the sun was a veil, was it exploited or merely convenient? If exploited, does that imply intent to hide or simply a practical respect for our attention span? If a visitor will do this again, will it choose a new rhythm or trust that we will never listen for the old one? Let this thought rest where it can breathe. Natural storms teach humility. Patterns teach alertness. The calm posture is to hold both truths and watch the next bright day without flinching. The glare loosens first, not the questions. The sun steps aside a little. The cameras remember how to breathe. The traveler will walk back into darkness, and darkness is where patterns speak. Begin with the simplest promises the sky can keep. When Atlas emerges, its light curve will stop pretending to be a rumor. Variations in brightness across hours will resolve into a rhythm or refuse to. If the body is natural and ragged, the curve should wander without gassing and jets. If the curve clicks into neat spacing that holds for several rotations, you are not looking at weather. You are looking at a habit. Hard fact 1. Non-gravitational accelerations betray themselves when precise astrometry refuses to sit still. Comets show small pushes from jets. Engineers model that push with simple parameters and watch residuals drop. If Atlas walks out of glare and the best fits keep forgetting to explain its motion, note the direction of the forgetfulness. Push away from the sun is ordinary. Side pushes that alternate on a clock are not. Hard fact 2. Spectra will go from scraped to honest. Nickel and other heavy lines that whispered through glare will face a fair trial. A natural coma favors broad blends and changing ratios as temperature cycles. A repeating muscularity in a narrow set of lines hints at edges that heat like parts, not pebbles. Grounded speculation 1. Polarimetry is quiet to the public and loud to the careful. Dust scatters light differently when grains are shaped by industry rather than fracture. A step in polarization angle at a fixed phase can suggest structure that repeats on a rotation. You do not need a photograph to feel a panel turn. Grounded speculation 2. Radar at long range is ambitious but not absurd. A patient transmitter can paint a coarse silhouette if reflectivity cooperates. Even a null tells a story. If a body that should glint like ice and rock refuses radar attention twice in a row, that is a personality trait, not a mood. Practical listeners will want a checklist they can pin above a desk. Keep it short. Light curve regularity over 1 day. Spectral lines that firm up or migrate in a tidy cycle. Astrometric fits that push left, then right, with a period. Polarization changes that land like clock hands. A coma that thickens where heat should fade. Each by itself is a shrug. 3 in a row is a raised eyebrow. Vivid image for the night mind. Imagine a lighthouse on a distant black headland. As the beam swings, you expect the same wash of light to lick the water. Instead, the beam stutters at 2 points every turn, as if it passes across a braced frame. You cannot see the frame. You can feel its regular shadow in the pulse on the sea. There's a quiet laboratory we often forget. Occultations turn the world into an instrument. When a faint visitor crosses a star, scattered eyes on Earth watch the star's breath. A clean, geometric body draws crisp chords. A messy coma smears them. If Atlas carries rails or ribs, multiple stations will record small, repeatable steps where edges should be soft. Even 2 chords with the same kink, observed hundreds of miles apart, act like fingers reading a spine. Return to anchors so the room stays level. Photometric flicker can lie if clouds eat timing. Spectra can inherit false lines from calibration lamps that misbehave. Astrometry struggles when reference catalogs disagree by a hair. Polarization is a field that punishes sloppy optics. Radar echoes fall into silence for many honest reasons. The discipline is to stack methods until the lie runs out of places to hide. The week of the hush handed us predictions whether we wanted them or not. If a gamma shelf reappears with Atlas outside solar glare, that shelf should walk with its path and care little about the sun's smaller moods. If the old satellite cough was more than romance, the same altitudes should tick again when the traveler's geometry aligns with those belts. If the magnet rectangles were part of the same clock, small steps will return in mid-latitudes on a day that forecast models swear is boring. These are not commands. They are invitations. A small detour into the ground beneath our feet. Power grids do not like surprises, but they report them quickly. If hums and hushes repeat, you will see a handful of reactive power adjustments that feel too neat in operator forms again, separated by the same span. Pipelines will show small geoelectric flirtations in pairs. Cryo systems at radio observatories will log gentle housekeeping hiccups that match the reappearance window. None of this proves a traveler is working. Together, it sketches a posture. We should talk about time, because time is how this story tries to introduce itself. Keep a clean notebook with minutes, not just feelings. Mark when the high bands thin and when they return. Mark when polar routes breathe differently from expectations. Mark the interval between events. If the interval repeats when Atlas is clear of the sun, you are not measuring weather, you are measuring a machine's patience or a machine's needs. Skepticism sits at the same table as desire. There's romance in hunting signatures of engineering in the sky. There is also humility in finding none. If Atlas strolls out and behaves like any other long, cold stone pulled briefly through a warm yard, we will be grateful for the lesson in restraint. The channel will sleep better for it. HN is a mode, not a verdict. Imaginative leap, brief and careful. Suppose the traveler must trim its vector after the heat and pressure of conjunction. It cycles a field device at a duty that keeps torques inside narrow lines. That duty imprints on many instruments at once. Light curve kinks arrive twice a rotation. Spectra firm at edges on the same beat. The magnetosphere downwind practices 2 small holds that would never be noticed on a loud day. Even derelict orbital electronics feel a fingernail along their old traces. A culture that listens will hear all of this as a low, coherent chord. What about voices we have not measured yet? Very low frequency paths that thread under oceans might register a strange quiet in the gap between hushes. VLBI networks could try to track a non-gravitational wiggle directly, tying phase to a clock that refuses to lie. Atmospheric total electron content maps from dense GNSS constellations may draw shapes that look carved rather than painted. None of these are science fiction, they are just work. Hard fact 3. Non-gravitational acceleration parameters, when published for interstellar visitors, carry real uncertainty and honest pain. Oumuamua taught us about light pressure on odd shapes. Borisov taught us about ordinary comets making extraordinary headlines. A third visitor will teach us something else, and we must prefer the lesson to the myth. Grounded speculation 3. If Atlas carries conductive scaffolding under dust, polarization angles should exhibit a small step as edges heat and current finds a path. That step would repeat at angle and phase, even as overall brightness drifts with distance. No dust model alone loves that kind of loyalty. Another vivid image for sleep. Picture an old wristwatch held to your ear in a quiet room. You thought it was broken. Now, after days of silence, it ticks. Not fast, not loud, just steady enough that you begin to count without meaning to. The minutes it measures are not yours. They belong to something that has somewhere else to be. As observers, we also watch earthbound behavior. Institutional silence is not guilt. It is often grace. When release is slow, note whether teams substitute generic updates or offer specific calibrations that explain delay. Note whether quick-look dashboards quietly add new, derived products like polarization summaries or high-cadence photometry that were not there last month. Those are signs of people building the right tools rather than hiding answers. Practical caution. Avoid chasing mirages in low bitrate social clips or reprocessed screenshots with contrast pulled until they scream. If a frame matters, it will survive new light. If a pattern matters, it will be kinder under better data, not crueler. The best thrillers are the ones that end with a graph that looks boring to the wrong eyes. Questions remain the instrument that costs nothing and buys clarity. If the first hush and second hush were a pressure test, what interval would repeat when Atlas returns? If the gamma shelf was a breath from a device, what energy range should strengthen now that the sun is less of a bully? If derelict satellites coughed because a field combed their shell, which altitudes should clear their throats again, and on what minute? We finish by folding the list small enough to keep in a pocket. Watch the light curve for regular kinks. Watch spectra for lines that harden and soften on a beat. Watch astrometry for fits that push sideways in a cycle. Watch polarization for small steps at fixed phase. Watch GNSS tech maps for carved shapes, not clouds. Watch VLF and HF for twin quiets on quiet days. Watch old satellites for brief carriers in the same windows. Watch gamma shelves that walk, not spikes that brag. Watch how politely everything returns to baseline afterward. If nothing on that list stirs, we will let the story join the shelf where weather lives. If several stir together, we will add new columns and keep counting. Set this page down gently for now. The glare is thinning. The traveler is almost back in the dark where small truths are visible. When it steps out, the first numbers will be the quietest and the best. Will they fold into weather, or will they whisper a cadence that does not belong to stone? If October's hush was a message, it did not use our alphabet. It wrote in negative space and trusted us to notice the outline of what was missing. Twice the world's airwaves leaned into quiet. Twice they released, and the shape of that silence looked less like a sentence and more like a hand sketching a circle around the way we live. Begin with a calm foundation. In communications, absence can speak. On-off keying is as old as the first spark gaps. A null sent at the right moment is not nothing. It is a bit. At planetary scale, the medium is not a cable, but the ionosphere, and the switches are not relays, but chemistry. When a silence arrives with edges neat enough to measure, it becomes a symbol, whether or not anyone intended it to be one. Another anchor. Strong solar days produce Dellinger blackouts across the sunlit face of Earth. They're real, and they are routine. Yet, the two-window cadence we tasted on the 21st did not behave like a smear of weather. It behaved like a pause pressed to gather a reading, then a second pause to confirm the reading. If you were teaching a student to measure resilience without breaking anything, that is how you would design the test. What then did the silence say about the sender? One possibility is courtesy. A civilization that understands failure modes might prefer to speak in gentle subtractions instead of adding noise. Push only as hard as needed to see the outline of our systems. Use a loud solar day so that the experiment hides inside plausible storm behavior. Keep the intervals short enough that hospitals frown but do not fail. Step back and take notes. A second possibility is caution. If you worry that your voice could wound, you do not transmit content. You perturb the environment we already monitor and watch how we flinch. The message is not meaning, it is measurement. A species competent at long missions would favor this style. It spends little energy, collects vast information, and avoids the ethical weight of speaking directly to minds tuned for narrative rather than physics. A third possibility is indifference with a trace of elegance. We were not meant to hear anything. A device trimmed its vector, and we happened to live downstream of its wake. The measured hush was our interpretation of someone else's maintenance schedule. If contact hides here, it is contact the way moonlight is a conversation with stone. Grounded speculation, kept within daylight. If the silence carried intent, it conveyed properties rather than propositions. It told us someone could modulate the ionospheric mirror by pressing on the wind with a controlled field or sail. It told us the actor kept collateral low. It told us the intervals mattered more than the depth of the hush, which points to a reading of our response time rather than a desire to erase our voice. In information theory, what you choose to vary is the part of the channel you care about. Here, the variable looked like cadence. Another grounded angle. The choice of medium suggests the sender knows the way we watch ourselves. Nations publish near real-time ionospheric indices, magnetometer traces, GNSS total electron content, and grid conditions. Pressing on the sky during a solar day lets the sender observe our own dashboards as if they were your instruments. Speak in a language the listener already graphs. That is thrift, bordering on genius. A vivid image for the night mind. Picture a library at closing, where the lights remain on, but the air handler switches off for a minute. Pages do not turn. The rustle stops. Pens hover. 2 minutes later, the fans return. Quiet resumes its ordinary texture. On the camera above the doorway, the pattern of stillness is a perfect map of how the room breathes when no one is trying to perform. If you were studying the library, you would learn more in that pause than in a day of chatter. Hard fact to hold us steady. Intentional interference that aims to cause harm tends to escalate or to aim at narrow targets that matter most. The day did neither. The hushes were broad and brief. Polar routes, which often suffer first, were oddly resilient in places. Equatorial paths, which often relax sooner, clipped out in narrow, disciplined bands. Power grids did not complain beyond minor housekeeping. Spacecraft kept their posture. The shape looks like a probe of system response, not a rehearsal for damage. Another hard fact. If this was a message, it was not one for the general public. Most people slept through it. The only ears fit to receive it belonged to operators, scientists, and the few who nurse radios like small gardens after midnight. This is not superiority, it is targeting. You do not leave bread on the steps for birds you cannot feed. You leave a pencil sketch on the chalkboard of the one classroom where the careful gather. Here's the imaginative leap, brief and cool. Suppose the silence means, we see you, not as individuals and not as nations, but as a planetary network with reflexes. We can touch your medium without breaking your bones. We can time your reroutes and your backups. We can map which parts of your nervous system hesitate and which run by themselves. We can do this in a way that grants you deniability and us data. If that reading holds, then the message adds a corollary. We are not here to talk. We are here to calibrate. What does that imply about the sender's time? Patience, first of all. A culture in a hurry would broadcast. This one's sampled. It suggests technological maturity that values return on energy and tolerates ambiguity. It also implies a tolerance for being misunderstood. They let the sun take the blame. We would do the same at ocean scale. We would tuck our tests into the tide. Grounded speculation with teeth. The cadence could be a handshake. In cryptographic protocols, a handshake proves presence without disclosing secrets. At civilizational scales, the analog is a reversible test that shows reach and control without leaving scars. Two equal pauses inside a natural storm, neither long enough to harm, both sharp enough to be seen by the right eyes, comprise a handshake that says we know where your attention is and how to move it gently. There is a humbler reading that still earns respect. Perhaps the silence says nothing about them and everything about us. It reveals that we will construct messages from neatness because consciousness abhors random. It reveals our need to interpret coincidence as plot. The discipline here is to build instruments that can falsify our own romance. In the next weeks, the right response is not to assign motive, but to design tests. If the cadence returns when Atlas returns, we learn something. If it does not, we learn something cleaner. We should talk about ethics, because even maintenance can bruise. Turning down a planet's voice is not trivial. Even a kind hush risks an ambulance missing a check-in, a pilot repeating a call, a fishing boat feeling alone. The shortness of the windows looked like restraint. The choice of a loud solar day looked like care. But care without consent is still a kind of trespass. If this was intentional, the sender measured us and spared us in the same breath. First contact, written in the grammar of boundaries. A second vivid image to hold softly. Imagine a diver in the dark sea passing a coral city. Rather than shining a lamp, they cup their hands and still the current twice. For a moment the fronds stop waving, the fish hold position, and the city's inner rhythm is revealed. The diver moves on. The reef resumes. No one was injured. No one asked permission. The reef keeps its mysteries. The diver keeps a notebook. Let the Fermi question continue its quiet work. Why have we not heard voices? Perhaps because voices are expensive and ethically heavy. Perhaps because the mature way to study neighbors is to read their wind rather than their poetry. The paradox softens if the galaxy prefers field notes to speeches. What should we do with a message like that? The practical answer is to build a plain checklist for response long before any press release exists. Preserve raw data with honest clocks. Encourage independent replication across latitudes. Share openly without drama. Favor instruments over adjectives. Teach the public that calm curiosity is a kind of safety. If it happens again, treat cadence as the content and resilience as the reply. We can add a smaller, gentler line. If courtesy lived in the hush, courtesy should live in our answer. Do not shout at the sea because it lapped at your ankles with unusual rhythm. leave markers, exchange notes, prepare, measure, sleep. The last questions belong to the bedside. If silence was the medium, what tone did it carry? Was it a kind pressure test from careful neighbors, a rehearsal embedded in a storm, or a byproduct of work we were never meant to notice? If it was hello, are we ready to say anything back that is not louder than necessary? Night returned our noise, but something in the room still listened for a rhythm that was not ours. The bands refilled, the graphs smoothed, and yet the quiet left a watermark you could feel with your fingertips. We gather what remains after the loud parts leave. Two measured hushes that fit together like matched stones. Magnetograms that practiced rectangles across longitudes that seldom agree. Old satellites that cleared their throats in the same windows. A rumored gamma shelf that did not brag, only held. A penciled glance from Mars that never blossomed in public. None of this forces a verdict. All of it suggests a shape. Hard fact 1. Planetary radio blackouts during strong solar days are ordinary, global, and often messy. D-layer absorption deepens, HF paths fail on the sunlit face, and recovery follows the sun's temper. We teach this to first-year students because it works. Hard fact 2. Interstellar visitors are real and do not belong to myth. We have logged their hyperbolic paths, measured their light curves, and learned that from elsewhere does not imply impossible. Conjunction is not a trick. It is geometry, and geometry starves telescopes, a grounded speculation that refuses to run ahead. If a secondary actor pulsed a field or switched a sail inside the storm, the ionosphere could have carried a pair of neat signatures, while the larger weather kept the story plausible. The sun gave us the fog. Someone may have walked through it. Another grounded speculation that keeps its shoes on. If no actor existed beyond the star, then the neatness belonged to thresholds and structure we have undermodeled. Double window blackouts could form when particle precipitation, traveling disturbances, and delayed chemistry stack just so. The rectangles might be a beautiful accident we had not yet learned to expect. Vivid image for the night mind. Picture a city after rain. Traffic returns, but a faint track of puddles keeps a perfect cadence down one alley, as if a cyclist passed twice with careful spacing. Cars and footsteps do not erase the geometry. You can still see where the rider was. We turn to the nature of echo. An echo that outlives its source is not sound, it is habit. After the hush, operators kept timing their check-ins with unusual precision, as if the day had taught them to count minutes again. Amateur logs noted a coordinated trial of backup paths that would have been ordinary during a longer crisis, but felt elevated in a brief one. A scatter of research groups set new alerts for polarimetry, tech maps, and low-frequency monitors that had slept through funding cycles. Silence fired work without saying a word. Hard fact 3. The week did not break machines. Grids kept posture, spacecraft held attitude, aviation rerouted lightly, and critical nets resumed. Whatever pressed did not scar. For a story tempted by nightmare, that is a sobering and important boundary. Here's the imaginative leap, carried gently. Suppose the hush was a lesson in cadence. A civilization that prefers engineering over theater tells us how it learns by asking us to show how we recover. It does not ask for meaning. It asks for timing. We answer by revealing the speed and grace of our reroutes, the elasticity of our nets, the kindness of our fallbacks. If that is so, the first contact is not with a voice. It is with a stopwatch. We keep the skeptics seated at the table because sleep needs fairness. If the hush was entirely solar, then the lesson is about us anyway. We saw neatness and turned it into agency because humans fear coincidence less than they fear emptiness. The remedy is a calendar and a list, not a sermon. When Atlas steps from glare, watch the items we named. If they do not stir, let the romance rest. A small, practical litany for the nights ahead. Pare down until it fits in a pocket. Save raw streams with honest clocks. Compare across latitudes and instruments. Prefer boring explanations until the boring ones are exhausted. Treat cadence as content if it reappears. Be precise when you say aligned. Admit it when you wanted a pattern and the sky did not agree. The echo also lives in how institutions breathe. Even those who doubt the week's choreography began to discuss playbooks in quieter hallways. What to publish first if intervals return. How to protect public calm while honoring data. Which pipelines need upgrades so that conjunction does not turn into a myth factory. This is not a panic reflex. It is the way grown-ups acknowledge a new category in their taxonomy of days. One more vivid image before the lights soften. Imagine a lighthouse keeper who, after 2 perfect pauses in the beam, oils the gears and checks the spare mantle. Not because the pauses hurt anything, but because the pauses made him remember the beauty of maintenance. The sea does not need to explain itself for him to do better work at night. A last question with a quiet edge. If the hush was a message, did we answer without knowing? Did our paired resilience and restraint say more about us than any broadcast could? And if it was only weather, did we still learn the right lesson by acting as if someone watched? Let that question hover while we drift toward the slow close. The room is dim and wide. The hiss of ordinary static returns like rain on a roof you trust. Outside, the traveler moves along its hard arc, a long body or a long habit, wrapped in dust and intention we cannot read. Tomorrow, its angles will be kinder. Instruments that slept will wake. Someone will check a box that says, "Observe if geometry allows." And a different hand will write patience in the margin with a small smile. However the next frames fall, our craft is the same. We count, we compare, we resist the appetite for drama, and we keep a small place ready for wonder in case the sky earns it. If the cadence returns, we will notice without shouting. If it does not, we will file this week among the elegant storms and be grateful that our models gained a new wrinkle. The scale widens. Stars do not owe us explanations. Planets sing in frequencies too slow for the body to feel. We sleep under rules that we're here before our first spark and we'll be here after our last. Somewhere in that arithmetic, courtesy is possible. A traveler can test gently. A species can listen kindly. The universe does not need our consent to be mysterious, but it rewards our composure, our breathe in. The distance between mysteries and us is not measured only in kilometers. It is measured in the clarity we bring to the nights when the data asks for humility. Tonight, clarity is quiet. Let the instruments run. Let the mind loosen its grip on verdicts. Let sleep arrive like a tide that folds over questions without drowning them. If you find yourself counting the minutes between ordinary things tomorrow, that is part of the echo. If you wake and cannot remember the shape of the hush, that is part of the mercy. Either way, we will be here when the glare thins, with the same soft light and the same calm table, ready to sort what the sky returns. Rest now. The storyline does not need us to hold it up. The graphs will wait. The traveler will do what travelers do. And the silence, whether it was message or weather, will keep teaching as long as we are gentle enough to learn.